All right, friends, if you want your kiddos to head to Children's Church, now is the appropriate time to follow Mr. Doug. Flute in hand, he's going to lead them down. We don't normally, just by way of reminder, while they're moving, go ahead and turn your Bibles to Luke 18 real fast. We're going to preach out of Romans 1, but I want to do Luke 18 super quick. We don't normally do Children's Church. We like families to worship together. But the content of this passage is such that we want to honor parents, and parents teach different kids different things at different times because no two children are alike. And so we want to be sure it looks like everybody's out of the room, and I have bought enough time. Cool, Luke 18. So let's start in verse 9. I'm going to read this and then explain why I'm reading this. Here's Luke 18, verse 9. He also told this parable, this is Jesus talking, to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. You can flip back over to Romans 1 if you would like. My prayer this week and my fear for us is that we come into texts like this one that is very explicitly going to teach about same-sex attraction and the perils of it. And somehow or the other, we might walk out of here with self-righteousness in our hearts instead of humility. That is the opposite of what I want to accomplish here, right? I do not want us to feel like, I made mention last week of the fact that the church sometimes feels like a place where we just lob hand grenades out into the culture and talk about all those wicked people out there. And I feel like if you read these verses and you do that, you completely missed what Paul is trying to do here, right? Because Paul is definitely going to be pulling out same-sex attraction. And we're going to be talking about that and transgenderism and where we are in the culture. We're going to talk about all those things. But he's pulling them out so that he might make for all of us an example, an illustration of the perilous nature of sin, of where sin goes if it's left unchecked, of what happens to the human soul when it's left, as we said last week, to stew in the juices of its own wickedness. That's what Paul is after. So there's no bones about it, but I don't think, and maybe I do, I don't think I have to preach an entire sermon about the fact that homosexuality is sinful. I'm imagining that most of you, at least those of you who know me, know that I'm going to say that. I don't think I have to preach to you about the fact that the culture is moving in some terrible directions and we all hate it and we can lament it all we want to on Facebook. I don't have to tell you any of those things. What I would like to do today is to show you what Paul is doing. Because what Paul is doing is he's digging deeper. And he's showing us the roots. What drives this behavior? Where does it come from? How do we address this with the gospel? How do we speak the truth in love? We talked about that in the Equip class today. Those are my goals. Because the root of the problem really at its core doesn't really have anything to do with sex or sexuality. The root of the problem is the same as the root of all of our problems, which is idolatry. We are functionally idolaters. Our sin is some variety of self-worship. And same-sex attraction, transgenderism, those sorts of issues are the same root. The fruit, the way it presents itself is different, for sure, and must be addressed. But the root of the thing, we are not unlike these people. So my hope is that we get to the end of this and we don't respond like the Pharisee. We don't point fingers and just thank God that we're not like those people in a way that seems self-righteous. But instead, we're more like the tax collector who just humbly before God praises him for his marvelous grace to rescue us from the sin that would have led us in the same direction that their sin leads them. Everybody got it? In other words, I'm anti-self-righteousness. My righteousness is filthy rags before the Lord. Christ's righteousness in me. That's something. All right, so that's my goal for today. I want us to see that homosexuality, same-sex attraction, transgenderism, you put all that together and we've got all these different categories now. All of this is contrary to the design of God, okay? Because it is idolatrous. And from that idolatry leads lots of other things that lead to this inversion of God's design. So, as an aside, before we get started too much into this passage, last week we talked about the fact that God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity. That was last week's passage, right? So it's not getting any lighter. Like this, the end of Romans 1 is heavy stuff, and it's supposed to feel heavy for us. Like we've got a couple of more. We get done to the end of Romans 1. We're going to take a little break from Romans because I feel like we all kind of need it. Like it'd be nice to get a little bit of that lifted off our shoulders for a few minutes before we get into Romans 2. Everything he's saying about the world in Romans 1, he's going to say about all the really good churchy people in Romans 2. So if you've been going to church your whole life and you think you're pretty good, the last thing you want to do is hear anything I got to say out of Romans 2, because it's going to indict all of us even more so than we've already been indicted. But when we get towards the end of Romans 1, last week he's talking about the fact that God gave people over to the lust of their hearts to impurity. And I made reference to the fact that word as well had some sexual undertones, overtones. For sure, we addressed materialism and the sin of materialism and how the sin of materialism is idolatrous. So you don't have to have a lot of goods in order to want a lot of goods. It's not just wealth, it's the desire of wealth, it's the love of money. We talked about humanism, the fact that humans are essentially good creatures is this idolatrous thing. But there's also, when Paul's talking about this, there's also some sexual immorality going on here. And the Bible is pretty clear about sexual immorality as a whole, not just homosexuality, but heterosexuality done outside of God's design. So I'll make reference to a couple of times to the fact that God's design for biblical sexuality is for a husband and a wife to be in a monogamous sexual relationship for a lifetime. That was God's design. Anything that's not that is out of bounds. And so is a result of the effects of Romans chapter 1. Okay? Now, that we're all more offended than we were when we got started, we want to dig a little bit more into this particular passage. So, in order to get here, one more thing I want to do. Remember, we started back in verse 18 with, therefore, so we've got for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and wickedness. I want to walk through what we've seen so far. Very quick summary. Humans are created as worshipers. We are created with an innate ability to see God's power and nature in the things that have been made, according to Paul. But instead, we suppress the truth. We push the truth down. We we worship the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. In other words, we worship things or people instead of God, right? That's the foundation for everything else that Paul's going to say in Romans chapter 1. We worship things or people instead of God. Why? Because we suppress the truth in our unrighteousness. So what happens? This is last week, the heaviness of last week. God hands people over to their desires. In other words, what we said last week is the judgment of God in many cases is to give you exactly what it is that you want. Because the thing that you want more than God becomes a God to you. And there are times where God looks at particularly the non-Christian and says, okay, if that's what you want, you may have it. And so then we keep running, and we talked about where this leads to, right? It leads to the desires that we have enslaving us, and then what happens is we act outwardly based on what we want inwardly. Now, with that common ground in mind, that phrase right there, we act outwardly based on what we want inwardly, you can address a whole host of sins in your life, right? Why do I do X, Y, Z? Why is this action happening? Because you're acting outwardly based on what you are inwardly, based on what you want, and more importantly, based on who you think you are. And so I want us to see that, and I'm going to come back to this phrase maybe a couple of times. But all sexual sin is the same way, okay? All sexual sin, generally speaking, has almost nothing to actually do with sex. It has to do with identity and idolatry. Now, it may be weird for you to have a pastor standing up here in a Sunday morning sermon talking about sex. I'm sorry for that, sort of. But here's the reality. The world is talking about it. The culture is talking about it. Your kids are being taught about it. If you put your kids in front of a screen, they're being taught about it at a much faster rate than you think. If the church isn't talking about it, then we're giving no one any biblical categories for how to address this situation. So you guys just sit there and feel uncomfortable, okay? And I'll feel uncomfortable saying it. We'll all feel uncomfortable together, and we'll glorify God because He's put it in the Scriptures. Deal? Deal. All right, we got that out of the way. So here we go. So ultimately, here's what I want us to see. What is happening? We talked about last week that there's a truth exchange that takes place in the life, okay? In order for us to sin, there has to be an exchange of the truth of God for a lie. And all of our sin is a truth exchange. The same is going to be true with same-sex attraction. Okay? With homosexuality, it is a truth exchange. What is the truth exchange? Well, it's a very simple one. Okay? It's 4 words for 3, if you will, to succinct. I'm going to explain it a lot more than this. It's God has made you for you do you. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. One of the things that we must receive as true in order to understand this world and how to live in this fallen world is the fact that God has made us. He has created us. And having created us, He has then created us and put us in a universe that exists in an order with a structure that He has set. And so part of what it means to be a Christian is to submit our lives to the order and structure that God has made. Right? So we just start there. And we see, can you see how quickly this runs off the rails? Because that fundamental truth, you are a created thing, created in the image of God, in order to function within a universe that God has made in a way that God has dictated, is so different than what the world teaches, generally speaking. Because what the world teaches, particularly now, is something that a guy named Carl Trueman wrote a book called Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Incredible book. If you've never read it and you really like to read, you should read it. If you hate to read, you can just listen to what I'm getting ready to say, because it's not an easy book to read. All right, but here's what Trueman calls this expressive individualism. And let me explain what he means by that. You can summarize where we are as a culture with 3 basic statements. Okay? 3 basic statements that drive identity. Because from the earliest age, we talk about parents or teenagers, I say, kids always ask 2 questions, right? Number 1, actually maybe 3. Number 1, who am I? Number 2, can I trust you? And number 3, can I get away with it? Those are the 3 questions that all kids ask basically all the time. You know, the reality is, we ask as adults the same question. The who am I question drives us. How many of us are prone to identify ourselves based on the children that we parent or the job that we work? Most of us structure identity is at the root of what we think we are. I mean, social media wouldn't exist if our culture did not have an identity crisis, because we desperately need validation for what we think we are. And that's the first thing. The first thing you got to understand about what the culture is teaching and promoting is this. Your identity is based in your feelings. You are what you feel. Now, the Bible's not teaching this at all. You guys should know that. If you've heard me preach for longer than 5 minutes, you know how I feel about feelings. All right? But the reality is the world around us is teaching us you are what you feel. So that's where, for instance, a statement that would have made no sense at all to anyone 100 years ago is the statement, for instance, I am a woman trapped in a man's body. That is a nonsensical statement. If you think about it, you break it down. So what is the person who makes that sort of statement ultimately saying? They're saying, I have these feelings, I have these desires are in me, therefore, they must be who I am. Do you see what just happened? We just based our identity on our feelings. Now, if you don't think you do that, I got news for you. And we may not do that with sexual orientation, but we do that with lots of other things, don't we? I mean, just the very idea of job satisfaction. The fact that most of us would evaluate our jobs based on whether or not our jobs make us happy demonstrates the fact that we have bought the lie the world is selling. That your identity is wrapped up in your happiness. If I feel happy at my job, therefore I am fulfilled, therefore this is what I am. We've done this. I spent the last part of my week lamenting the fact that we do this with young men who are called to ministry. The first way we evaluate whether or not a young man is called to ministry is not to take him to 1 Timothy and look at the actual qualifications for a person to be an elder or a deacon. The first thing we do is we say, do you feel called? We literally base the legitimacy of a young man's calling to ministry on their feelings. What garbage is that? It's not biblical. Right now, it's a good thing to feel called. I feel called, but my feelings are secondary to the fact that I fulfill these qualifications as outlined in Scripture. All right? So don't think we don't do this. I think Christians have gotten better at it than almost anyone else. We just do it in a different way. But the person who struggles with gender confusion or same-sex orientation, they feel these things. And because they feel these things, they determine, therefore, I must be these things. So understand, that's the first statement. We wrap our identity up in our feelings, but your feelings are untrustworthy, right? And if I've been created by God to live within an order and a structure, I must know that I can't trust my feelings because I'm a fallen creature. All right, so that's number one. Number two, so after the fact that I am what I feel, the next thing is this. The highest goal of the human, the highest goal of the person is self-expression. I need to be free to say who I am to everyone that will listen. And the greatest freedom that I can experience is self-expression. I need to be free to talk to everybody about who I am. I found out who I am because I know what I feel, says the world. And if I found out who I am because I know what I feel, then I need to be free to tell everybody. The word we commonly use here is authenticity. I need to be authentically me. Well, I got news for you again. The Bible cares nothing about you being authentically you. It cares a lot about you being conformed to the image of Christ, right? And so now we've got this, so now you understand, you guys following me so far? If I am what I feel, right, and the highest goal is for me to be able to express what I feel, well, now I'm going to get, that opens the window a little bit into why it is so important that people who generally believe this way come into your life at the earliest age possible. Because what are they trying to do? They're trying to liberate you, to be free, to be who you really are. And so you've got this push to constantly promote the education of our young people into same-sex attraction and transgenderism. Why? Is it just because they want to kidnap your children? No. It's because in their gospel, lowercase g, the highest goal is self-expression. And so if we can find kids early and help them to figure out who they really are, then we can help promote this. And then the next thing you know, you've got an entire culture, an entire generation of people that truly believe that they are what they feel, and this is what they feel. Now, notwithstanding the fact that most of the reason they feel that way is because they feel that way in order to be pleasing to an authority that's been put into their lives, right? Your kids believe some things because you've taught them to believe them, either on purpose or accidentally, right? I find that in my parenting life, it's easier for my kid to believe something that I've taught him on accident sometimes, but they believe what we teach them. And so, yeah, the highest goal is self-expression. Well, if the highest goal of my life is self-expression, then the ultimate authority in my life, and this is the third part, the ultimate authority is me. We call this humanism. I am my own boss. I am the captain of my soul, right? I am the one who gets to dictate how my life goes. The Bible has a lot of things to say about that too. I exist within God's system. He orchestrates my life in His way. And we hate that because we hate God until He changes us. Right? And so put these three things together. Okay? So if I am what I feel, I am the product of my feelings, and I feel these feelings towards a person of the same sex, or I feel like I might be a woman instead of a man, well, then what I've got to do is get that out. I've got to come out and be expressive and be able to declare this to the world. And anyone who prevents me from doing this is literally suppressing my identity and is doing violence, you hear this word often, doing violence to my view. You understand why there's such a visceral reaction about the church saying this is wrong? Is because the identity of the person is totally wrapped up in sexual orientation. We're not just saying this is wrong, we're saying you are wrong. You feel that? Right? When we feel the weight of how this builds on itself. And it all comes out of exchanging the truth of God, which is you are a created thing, created by God, with purpose, but His purposes are His purpose, in a structure, but the structure is His structure, for His glory, not for your own self or even for your own pleasure, but for His glory. When you exchange that truth for a lie, which is you are what you feel, the greatest thing you can do is be clear and expressive to the whole world about what you feel. That way you can be who you're really supposed to be, right? And then anyone who pushes against that is doing violence. You get the culture that we currently live in. That's it. That's the root, right? And so what happens, this is ultimately, one way or the other, some form of idolatry. We exchange the truth of God for a lie. And so, because we are primarily worshiping beings, we worship. And in this case, the identity that the person has assumed, has taken on for themselves, is expressed through their sexual orientation. It is an identity problem until we correctly and appropriately diagnose same-sex attraction, transgenderism, and all those things. Until we address those things as primarily worship problems, we will never get to the heart of the problem. The problem is worship. The problem is idolatry. Now, when we start to see it as fundamentally an idolatry problem, it hits a little bit closer to home with us, doesn't it? I mean, you may not be idolatrous in this way, but all of us, some way or the other, will be idolatrous in some way, will we not? Like that's a thing that we're prone to do. We said last week, our hearts are idol factories. This is a manufacturing, it is a worship first. It's a functional idolatry because it is an expression of misplaced identity, right? And so as Paul is writing, as he's walking through the problem of idolatry, he gets to this one and he sees in it the clearest expression that he could think of at the time to talk about the dangerous end results of idolatry. He is, and of course he did. One of the things we didn't talk about when we did our introduction to the book of Romans is where Paul was when he wrote Romans. If you know anything about the book of Romans, Paul was most likely in Corinth. Now, I don't know how much you know about Corinth. How much do you know about Las Vegas? Imagine that, only worse, and you're getting close. In fact, the city of Corinth had become so immoral by the time of Paul that they made a verb out of it. To Corinthianize meant to commit gross and unspeakable sexual immorality. So here's Paul sitting in Corinth, writing to the Romans to help them to become an equipped missionary outpost to carry the gospel to Spain. And what is the clearest example he sees of the functional idolatry of the human heart when left unchecked? Not a sin that he is committing, but a sin that he sees the others around him commit, which is same-sex attraction. So you see it? He's not picking on this in this particular text because he wants to hit these guys and somehow not pierce our hearts. No. He's hitting this because he wants us to also look inward, to see the sinfulness of our own hearts. But when he speaks about it, R.C. Sproul says this about this. He says, when the Apostle Paul describes the radical corruption of the human race, he sees the sin of homosexual behavior as the sin most representative of the radical nature of our fall. He's using it as an illustration. Why? Because of what he says in the text. And so it's probably good now to go ahead and start reading the verses. For this reason, verse 26 says, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. Why is this most representative? Because it's contrary to nature. Now, I want to talk about this. When Paul talks about it being contrary to nature, it's not so much an issue of desire as it is an issue of design. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. It's upside down. All right? It works against the way that God has created the universe to function. But I think for some of us, in order for us to get a picture of what upside down looks like, we have to first get a picture of right side up. So I want to think for just a moment. I do not have the time to preach an entire sermon on biblical sexuality. I will do that. One of these days, if we're going to preach the whole Bible, we're going to do a whole sermon series on Song of Solomon. It'll be really exciting. But for today, I'm going to give you the flyover view of what we're talking about here. So think with me, if you will, to Genesis 2. God creates man, says it's not good for man to be alone, creates woman, brings woman to man, first love song in the Bible, all right? This therefore is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, for she's been taken out of man. Therefore, for this reason, a man shall leave his wife, shall leave his mother, cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Okay, you got me there. Now, let's fast forward. The Bible says lots of other things about sexuality, but we can't do it today. Ephesians 5, okay? When Paul gives us a description of what the husband-wife relationship looks like, he uses a very particular illustration, and that is that the husband is like Christ, or you've got the husband is the head, the wife is the body. You've got this picture, and it's a mystery because it's a picture of how Christ relates to his church. Okay? Big overarching view. But what I want you to get at If I could help us think rightly about sex and sexuality in any way, it would be this. Biblical sexuality is biblical sexuality because it is primarily concerned with two others. First, it's concerned about God's glory. Second, it's concerned about the other person. Okay, you guys follow me? Now, maybe you've never heard that. Okay, welcome to biblical sexuality. All sexuality, correctly expressed, biblically expressed in healthy ways, as according to God's design, is outwardly and other-focused. In other words, for us as men, you think of being a young man and think, it's really hard to not be preoccupied with the fact that when you get married, you get to have sex. Well, you understand, when we build the foundation of our marriage upon things like that, you literally foundationally build the foundation of your marriage on selfishness. Because biblical sexuality is concerned about other. But here's the thing. It's not first the other person. It's first the glory of God. This is why, as Christians, we choose to participate, if God has called us to singleness, we choose to participate in celibacy. We refuse to have sex out of the context of marriage. Why? Because we're primarily concerned with God's glory, and God has created an order, and we live and function within that order. And for us to deviate that is not selflessness, it's selfishness. Right? This is why in the context of a dating relationship, you wait until you get married in order to have sex with that person. Why? Because you're primarily and fundamentally concerned with God's glory, and He has created a structure, and we live by His rules. We don't get to make our own. And I'm concerned about the other person. It's better for the other person for me to wait until we're married. Right? That's why in the context of marriage, we focus on the benefit and good and pleasure, nothing wrong with using that word, of the other person. Because to do so honors God and honors the spouse that God has given us. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most of us have never heard that behind a pulpit. And that is the tragedy of Western Christianity. The thing that the culture talks about the most, we talk about the least. And then we wonder why our kids are so confused. Because we don't talk about it. Right? But understand, biblical sexuality, right side up, when I talk about the fact that same-sex attraction is upside down, right side up is an other-focused expression of a God-given gift. God has given us sexuality to be expressed, and we express that by being focused on the two others, God and His glory and the other people around us. Right? You could run with that and have 3 sermons off of that one concept, but that's where it starts. And anything we do contrary to that design, when I boil it down, is no longer an expression for the benefit of others. It's an expression for the benefit of self, of me, right? So that works itself out in 2 different ways. I'm going to use 2 different words that we use a lot in our culture. Number 1 is perversion, okay? Sexual perversion. Don't think about it like pervert. Don't think of that word. Sexual perversion is the distortion or the corruption through sin of a God-given natural desire that's rooted in ungodly selfishness. So, pornography. The consumption of internet pornography is the consumption of another human for the benefit of self. Right? It's not just the consumption of the image. That's not what makes it so gratifying. What makes it so gratifying to the flesh is it's the actual consumption of a person. The destruction of another human for the benefit of myself. And so that's why we don't objectify women. Men, amen? Amen. Oh, no, one more time. Amen? Okay, good. I want to be sure we're all on the same page here. All right? Because when we do, whether that be a lustful look in the mall or a lustful look on your computer in the middle of the night when nobody's watching, you are intentionally consuming another human being. And that is not a woman's problem. That's your problem. For you personally, it's not that women don't do it, it's that men generally do it a whole lot more. Okay? So that distortion, for instance, you pick it, right? The sex outside of marriage. When we commit sexual acts outside the covenant of marriage, we almost never, I can't say never, I think if I thought about it hard enough I could say never, we almost never do that for the benefit of the glory of God. We never do that for the benefit of the other person. We do that to benefit us. Right? And we have to be honest about that. And so those things are a form of perversion. Why? Because they distort God's order. But then there's a whole other type, which is inversion. And that's where same-sex attraction or transgenderism comes into play. And inversion is the flipping upside down, the doing the opposite of whatever God has made. So we see inversion not just sexually, we see it in our worship. Instead of worshiping the Creator, we worship the creature. That's inversion. Okay? In same-sex attraction, instead of having this God-given desire to pursue relationship that is outward focused for the sake of another person, we now invert the order and we pursue pleasures that are against the natural order that is made by God. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's what you're doing. You're flipping up the same-sex attracted person, or the person who wrestles with transgenderism, is trying to flip upside down the structure that God has made to create a structure that's more palatable to suit their desires, because what I am is what I feel. See how it all builds together, right? It's all based on, it comes back to an identity thing. And so what does he say? Then we give up natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. The men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion. I love that. We think of consumed with passion in and outwardly. We talked about that the utilization of pornography or lustful thoughts towards women or men, for that matter, is the consumption of another person for your own benefit. But it's not just that you're consuming someone else. It's that thing that you think is freeing you is actually destroying you. It's actually eating you from the inside out. We're consumed with passion for one another. But it wasn't. The interesting thing is, it's not even primarily sexual passion. It's a passion to create your own identity. That's the root. The real root, for instance, particularly we see this expressed in transgenderism. The real root is for me to be able to create my own identity without having someone put a structure on me. But we don't get to function that way. It's not really how things function, but we're not that far. Think about Genesis chapter 11. All right? What was the great sin of the Tower of Babel? They said, come, let us build a tower that will reach up to heaven. Now, were they actually going to be able to build a tower that reaches up to heaven? I mean, no. We've built towers way taller than they could build. We still hadn't gotten there. What was the real desire? What did they say? They said, come, let us make a name for ourselves. You see what they're trying to do in 11? They're really trying to create a world and a structure without God so that they can create a name for themselves. But then you get to Genesis 12 and you get to God's promises to Abraham, and he says, I will make your name great. And there's this strong contrast between the person who pursues righteousness, living within God's order and structure, and according to God's time and in God's way, and the person who wants to build a name for themselves and do things in their own way and create their own structures. We're not that far. But what's the result of chapter 11? The people are consumed with passion. Go from chapter 11 forward to Sodom or Gomorrah. What do you see about these people who desired to make a name for themselves? They were consumed with passion and so felt a need to consume one another. And then after that consumption of passion, so you've got this men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. This shamelessness that comes from it. Why? Because we'll get to the end of next week and we'll see that the way sin runs in our own lives and in the lives of the people around me is not only do we sin, we give hearty approval to others who sin around us. Right? Which we're experiencing as a culture in many, many different ways. And so this shame then becomes displaced. So shame has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. And so in many of these cases, in the person who struggles with same-sex attraction or the person who's involved in transgenderism, instead of that shame being placed on them, the reality of the fact is that shame will be placed on you, who would speak openly about it. Now, we don't have to bear that. It's not ours to bear. But that's what we're experiencing as a culture, is it not? That when you speak this clearly, literally had a conversation with the media guys today about the fact that the chances are very high. We'll post this on YouTube. And it is a very high chance that someone listens to this and labels it as hate speech. Now, I hope that nothing that I have said comes across as hatred in any way. It is very much the opposite. That's not what I'm after at all. But why? Because the shame has to go somewhere, and the culture around us sees the people who are proclaiming the clarity of the gospel message as those who ought to be the objects of the shame that they themselves are forced to bear. And it's tragic. That shouldn't make us mad. It should make us very, very sad. Because it is ultimately an expression of the fact that God's order has been distorted to such a way that people are clearly exchanging the truth of God for a lie and worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator. And Paul says that they receive in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, what does that mean? There's 3 D's that I think when we're thinking about this particular sin and behavior. 3 things that happen: distortion, disease, or death. Okay? Distortion, number 1, the order is messed up, right? When we use our bodies in unnatural ways, unnatural things happen, period. If I took all the oxygen out of this room and filled it with carbon dioxide, then we would have an unnatural response to something that's happening unnaturally. If I had gotten up this morning and eaten a bowl of gravel for breakfast instead of a bowl of cereal, my body would respond in unnatural ways. Okay? So distortion, disease. I don't have to go into a lot of detail about that. We're all aware, right? Death. The wages of sin is death, but not just physical. The damaging of the soul. That's the worst part. The deadening of the human soul is far more tragic than the human carnage that exists because we refuse to submit and live within the system and structure that God has given us. Right? Because soul death lasts forever. And so we see this happening. And here's the reality. Thinking about death, just one quick statistic. I read a lot this week preparing for this one, but one of the things I read was from the Journal of Medical Medicine. And you'll not see this. I had to dig really hard to find it. It was from 2018. It was talking about those who experience gendered transition. Are you guys familiar with this concept? In other words, say, in this study, it was women who desired to take on the anatomical physicalities of a man. I will not say that a woman became a man. I can't say that. The 9th commandment tells me I cannot bear false witness. All right? God has set who they are. I cannot say that they're anything other than what God has set. Right? Take that for what it's worth. But a woman who wants to transition to be a male has, when that transition has completed, a 45% higher chance of suicide. 45%. You understand why this is, right? Because sin will never give you what it has promised you. It will never be able to satisfy in the way that it's promising you. It wouldn't be tempting if it didn't promise you things it can't fulfill, right? Like we wouldn't be tempted toward materialism if we didn't somehow really believe that the stuff that we wanted was somehow going to bring us fulfillment and help us with our identity. So we get this, right? But that's just one of many examples. The suicide rate among teens is sky high. And I'm telling you, there's a connection between what we're teaching our kids about gender and sexuality and what they're doing with their bodies and the ways in which they feel like they need to take their own lives. We're setting all of their hope on their sexuality. All of it. Your hope is in Christ or it's not hope. Your hope is in Jesus or you don't have any. And when we begin to say your fundamental identity is in your sexual orientation, we miss the Bible completely. Your fundamental identity is in connection to your relationship to God through Jesus Christ. That's it. And from that we build the foundation of everything else. If that's true, I live within His order, I operate according to His structure, and I find my satisfaction in Him. But that's got to be the building block. Otherwise, we have this experience. But understand that Paul's argument here is not that somehow or the other these people will experience the judgment of God. Paul's argument here is that these things are an example of the judgment of God. We've got to be careful because I think where we can miss it is you may have heard a sermon about homosexuality before, but it's also a very high chance that you've heard a sermon about same-sex attraction that you will hear somewhere at the end of that, God's going to judge these people. This is evidence that God is not only judging them, He's judging our culture. Right? This is already a judgment of God. John Piper says it this way: the sexual disordering of the human race is a judgment of God for our exchanging the truth of God for a lie. Plain and simple. And so let's throw this in with all the other heterosexual forms of sexual distortion, and you are seeing all around us all the time a version of the judgment of God. The wrath of God being revealed from heaven as God gives people over to the things that they want. And so according to Romans, God has been pouring His wrath out on this country for years, long, long before millennials were born. And so may we not be so quick to blame the generation that we taught for the problems that most of us created, or at least helped bring to fruition. Because it starts with identity. So, I have a lot more to say. And so, we're probably going to make this into an equip class that we get to spend some time interacting with and discussing with. But I wanted to stop with just how do we apply this, right? So how do we apply this text? Because I'm not a big fan of preaching sermons that apply to people who aren't in the room, right? Because that's not really the job. It's not the task of the preacher at all. And so I want to think about how we apply this. And so the first way I would think is this. How do we start understanding how to communicate the gospel with a person who is dealing with, on some level, same-sex attraction or feelings or thoughts about transitioning genders? And I would say, number one, go back to the basics. Number one, right here, all right? We think about a verse that I say all the time, or I try to say all the time, because I think it perfectly summarizes what the Christian gospel is. It's Jesus in the Gospel of Mark when he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Good. Want to make sure everybody was awake. Good job. All right. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow you. Now think about the three things I talked about at the beginning and contrast those with this word. The culture says you are what you feel. Jesus says deny yourself. Those two things could not be more opposed to one another, could they? Really? You know how often I have to deny my feelings when I really, really want donuts? Right? I have to deny, but I have to deny myself, right? And so to talk about that in a sexual sort of way is not a bad thing. I mean, Jesus is going to tell you lots of times you're supposed to deny yourself. Your sexuality is one of many different ways that Jesus is going to call you to deny yourself. If you're not prepared for that, you're not prepared for Jesus, right? So deny yourself. Take up your cross, as opposed to just be free to express yourself. Just be authentic and be who you are. No, Jesus says die. That's what he says. And if you're not willing to die to yourself, to your own passions, your own pleasures, and live within God's created order and according to God's structure, then you're not ready for Jesus. Right? And then he says, follow me. Meaning what? Meaning Jesus is authority. As opposed to you being your own authority. You've tried being your own authority. It hadn't worked out too good, has it? Didn't work out too good for me either. Still doesn't work out too good for me. When I decide that what I think is better than what God's Word has said, trouble happens. Right? And I wish I'd learned. I think by God's grace I'm learning a little bit. I wish I'd learned it faster and not the hard way. But the reality of the fact is, those three things. I mean, truly, you don't have to come. You can. But you don't have to come with every verse the Bible teaches about homosexuality. Just start with, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Because that runs contrary to the passions and pleasures that compete for the affections of all of our hearts, including the person who deals with same-sex attraction. Right? So that's number one. How do I talk to somebody? You don't have to memorize a bunch of verses. Just go to that one. That's a good one. All right? Number two, guard your heart from self-righteousness. I cannot express this enough. Next week, I almost said tomorrow. I am not ready to preach tomorrow. Next week, we're going to get 21 various and sundry sins. You know what Paul is doing? He went from a rifle blast to a shotgun blast, right? These two verses, rifle. This is an example. Next verse, shotgun. We're all guilty. You may not be guilty of this sin. You might be. You might not be. But you are guilty before God until you are declared righteous by the grace of God through the work of Jesus Christ. That alone should drive us to humility, not self-righteousness. May we be more tax collector and less Pharisee. If we desire to reach the world for the gospel, we have got to learn to be more tax collector and less Pharisee. You understand that Paul's desire for the whole letter of Romans is to see the Church of Rome built up so that it becomes the missionary outpost for all of Europe. Do you understand what that means? That means Paul's desire was to see the gospel spread in such a way that it reaped a harvest among those who wrestle with same-sex attraction. Now let me ask you a question, friend. When's the last time that you prayed that God would reap a harvest among the homosexual communities in the major cities in our country? I bet it hasn't happened very often. Can I encourage you to pray that way? That's what Paul is training us to do. It's how Paul is teaching us. It's how Paul wants us to move out, not with self-righteousness, but with deep humility, knowing I would have gone to places like this one had God not rescued me by his grace. It might not have been this place. It could have been far worse. But it's God's grace that rescues us. And so guard your heart from self-righteousness. Third, speak the truth in love. We talked about this in the Equip class today. I am never going to tell you to not speak to the issue. But I have found that for most of us, many of us as Christians, that's not the problem. We can speak about the issue. Maybe speaking to the person is a problem. I think for many of us, it may bring great feelings of discomfort to go and talk to a person who's dealing with same-sex attraction and to treat them like a human created in the image of God. Friends, can I submit to you that if it causes you that much discomfort, that's probably not a problem with them. We all like the idea of reaching the community with the gospel. We all like the idea of reaching the world with the gospel. We're going to see some things that may make us uncomfortable. We must trust the Lord and be willing to speak the truth. It's okay to say you think that things are wrong. It's how you say them that matters. One of the great challenges this week has been to try really, really hard to model for you what that sounds like, how it is you speak the truth in love, because I don't think we've heard it done really well very often. I know I haven't heard it done very well very often, and I'm not sure I did a great job of it. But man, I tried. Because that's what our calling is to do, is to speak the truth in love. And then finally, as we do so, we prepare for rejection, misplaced shame, and persecution. Right? People will reject you because you have spoken the truth. We try to soften that by saying, well, they're not really rejecting you, they're rejecting God. No, they're rejecting you, but you didn't need their approval anyway. And what does it matter if they're rejecting you? Let them reject you. They rejected Christ, and let them reject me too. Fine. But I must speak the truth in clarity with love, and I respond with grace. Right? It's going to happen. This is the air that our culture breathes, and it seems like it's going to continue to go in directions that make us exceedingly uncomfortable, that we do not like. We should lament that. We should see it for what it is, and we should respond with grace. Because Christ has called us, just like he's called everyone else, to deny ourselves, to take up our crosses, and to follow him. Which is exactly what we'll celebrate together today as we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Friends, as we take the Lord's Supper together, here's what I want us to focus on today, is just thinking about the fact that it's God's grace that called you into this community of believers, that enabled you the opportunity to celebrate the Lord's table together, that through his grace you've been given the chance to see. You know, were it not for God's grace, all the things that you see that are wrong right now, you wouldn't see them as wrong. You'd accept them as good. And it's all God's grace. And so when we take the table together, we do so remembering that the Jesus who said to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow him said so, having done all of those things perfectly and to the glory of the Father. And so I want you to think today, not just about those people out there. I want you to think about what God's done in you, for you, and by his grace, how he's transformed you. He's changed your life. He's made you into something you weren't before. And it's not because you were something, it's because he is everything. That's what we celebrate when we celebrate the Lord's table. So very quickly, some instructions.